Omar Al-Mansoor thought he had married the perfect bride, but Aaliyah Rahman's hidden past and his obsession with control turned their wedding night into a nightmare of betrayal, rage, and murder that would shock the world forever. The grand wedding of Aaliyah Khan and Omar Al-Fayed was the talk of Dubai, a spectacle of wealth and status that captured attention far beyond the glittering city. Omar, a billionaire known for his powerful family ties and influence, had spared no expense in showcasing his new bride to the world. Guests described the celebration as something out of a royal fairy tale, with chandeliers shimmering above golden banquet tables. Orchestras flown in from Europe, and floral arrangements imported from across the globe. For Aaliyah, the day was a whirlwind of lights, cameras, and the kind of luxury most could only dream of. Yet beneath her radiant smile, unease gnawed quietly at her heart. She knew the secret she carried could one day shatter everything. Aaliyah had grown up under the watchful eyes of her parents, Yusuf and Fatima Khan, who instilled in her a deep sense of duty toward family honor. When the proposal from Omar came, it was seen as a blessing, a chance for the Khan family to secure prestige and stability for generations. Aaliyah's mother whispered prayers of gratitude, while her father boasted proudly to relatives about his daughter marrying into one of the wealthiest households in the region. To them, Omar was more than a man. He was an empire, and Aaliyah's marriage was the golden ticket to security and power. But Aaliyah's past was not as pristine as her parents imagined. Before the engagement, she had experienced a relationship she kept hidden. One that left scars not visible to the world, but threatening her carefully arranged future. She carried the fear that Omar, with his demanding expectations and rigid sense of tradition, might one day uncover the truth. Omar valued purity and family honor above all else, a principle reinforced by his cousin, Sheikh Hamdan Al-Fayed, who often reminded him of the importance of marrying a woman untouched and untainted. As the newlyweds entered their lavish hotel suite in the United States, far from the watchful eyes of Dubai, Aaliyah felt the weight of her secret pressing harder than ever. The luxury around her seemed suffocating rather than comforting. Omar was affectionate but observant, and she sensed that beneath his calm smile lay the sharp instincts of a man who had spent his life scrutinizing those around him. His wealth gave him power, but his pride defined his character, and any crack in the image of perfection could ignite his fury. Among the wedding guests, whispers of jealousy and admiration spread. Aaliyah Rahman, Aaliyah's closest friend, smiled for the cameras, but knew the truth. Aaliyah had confided in her late one night. Nadia worried that the secret could explode, yet she also envied her friend for marrying into such unimaginable luxury. Meanwhile, Omar's sister, Amira, watched with suspicion, convinced that her brother's bride was hiding something. Amira believed her role was to protect the family's honor at any cost, even if it meant exposing Aaliyah. As night fell, and the celebrations faded, the story was just beginning. For Aaliyah, the wedding night loomed not as a continuation of joy, but as the moment when every carefully constructed lie would face its greatest test. The air was thick with tension, the kind that hinted this fairy tale was destined to turn into a nightmare. The honeymoon suite in New York was breathtaking. Perched high above the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows that gave a dazzling view of the skyline, to outsiders, it looked like the perfect beginning for Omar Al-Fayed and his new bride, Aaliyah Khan. A union blessed with wealth, power, and beauty. But behind the closed doors of that glittering suite, tension began to creep in like a shadow no luxury could keep out. Omar, a man raised to prize loyalty and purity, had grown restless in the hours following their celebrations. He was a man accustomed to control, one who believed perfection was not an option, but a duty. As he looked at his bride, his mind began turning with doubts that had been planted long before. Rumors had followed Aaliyah even before the wedding, though dismissed by her family as envious lies. There had been whispers of her time studying abroad, nights spent in the company of men who were not her relatives, and a shadow of a relationship that no one dared to name. Omar had brushed these rumors aside publicly, but in private they lingered, fueled by subtle remarks from his sister Amira and his cousin Hamdan. Both had warned him against marrying Aaliyah without ensuring she was truly the woman she appeared to be. For Omar, who viewed his reputation as a foundation of his power, the smallest doubt carried the weight of betrayal. As Aaliyah entered the room, dressed in delicate silk, her hands trembling slightly, she tried to mask her fear with warmth. But Omar's gaze was sharp, searching, almost interrogating. He spoke little, his silence more unnerving than any outburst could have been. Aaliyah sensed the shift in him and felt the tightening noose of her past. The memory of her previous relationship, the one she thought was buried in secrecy, seemed to rise in the room with them, pressing against her like an unseen witness. She told herself she could conceal the truth forever, but she underestimated how deeply Omar craved certainty. The first cracks showed in his demeanor when he asked her subtle questions, phrased innocently but layered with suspicion. He wanted details of her life before they met, moments she would rather forget. His insistence on precision, his probing about where she had been and who she had known, left her cornered. Omar was not merely curious. He was testing, pushing, to see if her words faltered. Aaliyah, caught between fear and desperation, gave careful answers. But her nerves betrayed her in small ways. A pause too long, a glance away, a tremor in her tone. By the early hours of the morning, the atmosphere in the room had grown heavy. Omar paced near the window, his mind racing. To him, uncertainty was poison, and in his eyes, Aaliyah was no longer the flawless bride he had paraded before the world, but a puzzle with missing pieces. Amira's voice echoed in his memory, warning him that a woman who brought shame could ruin not just a man but an entire family. The thought gnawed at him, and as he glanced back at Aaliyah, his heart hardened. Aaliyah sat quietly on the bed, staring at the city lights, knowing her life was balanced on a knife's edge. She told herself that Omar's suspicions might pass, that love or pride might shield her secret. But in truth, the game had already begun, and Omar was no man to accept uncertainty. He would search, he would test, and if a past came to light, the cost would not just be her happiness, it could be her life. The morning after the wedding should have been filled with calm and joy, but instead it began with silence that carried the weight of suspicion. Omar had left the suite early, claiming business matters, though in truth his absence had nothing to do with work. His instincts drove him toward uncovering what he feared most, and he had both the means and the connections to seek answers quickly. For a man of his stature, privacy was an illusion. Every piece of information about a person could be bought. Every secret eventually surfaced. He called upon discreet investigators, men skilled in tracing histories that others wished buried. Within hours, fragments of Aaliyah's life before their marriage began to assemble into a troubling picture. Meanwhile, Aaliyah tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. She dressed carefully, ordered breakfast, and waited for Omar's return, forcing herself to smile at the hotel staff who congratulated her as if nothing was wrong. But in her heart, dread twisted with every passing minute. She sensed Omar's coldness was not a fleeting mood, but the start of something dangerous. She thought of calling her mother back in Dubai, of confiding in her sister, but fear silenced her. To speak of her worries would only invite more judgment, and if Omar already doubted her, any attempt to defend herself might feed his suspicion. Omar returned late in the afternoon, his expression unreadable. He observed Aaliyah with a gaze that felt more like scrutiny than affection. In his hand, he carried a file, thin yet heavy with implication. He placed it deliberately on the table, though he did not open it in her presence. Instead, he watched her reactions, noting the unease in her eyes, as if her guilt was written across her face. For Omar, the silence was a test, and her every movement, every hesitation, was evidence. Over the following days, the honeymoon became an interrogation. Omar's questions grew sharper, no longer disguised as casual curiosity. He demanded too no details about her years abroad, pressing her for names, places, and dates. Each time she answered, he compared her words against the reports he had received. The investigators had uncovered an old affair, a relationship she had ended long before meeting him. While not scandalous in most societies, for Omar, it was betrayal of the highest order. To him, it meant she had concealed her past, had presented herself as pure when she was not. Aaliyah tried to explain that her past had no bearing on their future, that love and loyalty could exist despite mistakes. But Omar's pride was wounded, and in his world, image mattered as much as truth. The idea of being deceived gnawed at him, threatening not just his marriage but his identity as a man of honor. Each word from her lips sounded to him like another lie, and his silence became more dangerous than anger. By the end of the week, the one's luxurious suite felt more like a prison. Aaliyah's attempts to soften the atmosphere dinners, gentle words, even moments of affection were met with cold detachment. Omar was no longer the groom who had celebrated with joy, but a man consumed by doubt and resentment. In his mind, her crime was not only in her past, but in hiding it. And he began to believe that exposing her might be the only way to restore his dignity. Aaliyah sensed the shift and feared what was coming. She knew Omar's pride would not allow forgiveness, and if his suspicions turned into certainty, she would become the victim of his wrath. She lay awake at night, listening to his steady breathing beside her, wondering when love had turned into a silent war. Every passing hour tightened the rope of inevitability, pulling her closer to a fate she could not escape. The tension in the household reached its peak when Omar finally decided he could no longer keep his rage contained. 4 days he had rehearsed the confrontation in his mind, each imagined exchange fueling his anger until it hardened into a dangerous resolve. On a stormy evening, when the sky outside mirrored the darkness brewing within, Omar chose to act. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city lights beyond the tall glass windows. But inside, the atmosphere carried the weight of accusation. He summoned Aaliyah to the sitting room, where the file he had once placed on the table now lay open, its contents spread before him like evidence in a trial. Photographs, documents, and testimonies gathered from his investigators painted a story of her past. One he interpreted not as history, but as betrayal. He spoke with a coldness that cut deeper than any shout, his words sharp and deliberate, each syllable dripping with contempt. He accused her of deceiving him, of entering their marriage under false pretenses, of staining his honor with secrets she had no right to keep. Aaliyah stood trembling, her voice breaking, as she tried to defend herself. She pleaded that the past was just that past and that her love for him was genuine, untainted by what had come before. But her words did not soften him. Instead, they seemed to deepen his fury, as though her attempts to reason only confirmed his belief that she was skilled at hiding truth beneath polished lies. The more she spoke, the more convinced he became that she had calculated every step. From their first meeting to the wedding vows, all to secure a life she did not deserve. The argument escalated into shouting, Omar's pride clashing with Aaliyah's desperation. She fell to her knees, begging for him to see her as the woman who had chosen him, not as the mistakes she once made. But Omar's mind was clouded by the image of ridicule, by the fear of whispers from others should the truth emerge. In his world, betrayal could not be forgiven, especially not betrayal that struck at the core of a man's honor. For him, punishment was not just an option, it was a necessity to reclaim control. What followed was sudden, brutal, and irreversible. Omar, overcome by his rage and humiliation, lashed out in a way that crossed the line from anger into violence. The room that had once been filled with the promise of a new life together became the setting of a crime that would forever stain his name. The walls echoed with sounds that should never have existed in a home built on love, and in that moment, the bond between them shattered completely. When the silence returned, it was heavy and suffocating. Aaliyah lay still, her pleas silenced, her future stolen. Omar stood over her, his chest heaving, his hands trembling, not from regret, but from the magnitude of what he had done. He told himself it was justice, that she had brought this upon herself. Yet a part of him already knew the world would see it differently. As the storm outside subsided, the reality of the act began to close in on him. The body before him was not just a symbol of betrayal, but a reminder of the crime he could never undo. The luxury and wealth surrounding him suddenly felt like a gilded cage, trapping him with the consequences of his own pride. It was no longer about honor or dignity, it was about survival. And Omar knew that the discovery of what had happened in this house would send shockwaves far beyond its walls. Morning came slowly, the pale sunlight spilling into the vast estate, as if reluctant to illuminate the horrors of the night before. Omar sat in silence, staring at the lifeless form of Aaliyah, the woman he had sworn to cherish, now reduced to a haunting reminder of his rage. The house felt colder, emptier, its grandeur suddenly meaningless. He had spent hours pacing the marble floors, replaying the argument in his mind, searching for justification. But all that remained was the undeniable truth: he had killed his bride on their wedding night. The staff, unaware of the storm that had raged within the mansion, grew concerned when the couple did not appear for breakfast. Whispers began among the servants, but it was the housekeeper who finally approached the master's suite. Her soft knock went unanswered, and when she cautiously opened the door, the sight that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs. She let out a piercing scream, one that echoed through the entire estate. drawing guards and staff rushing to the scene. Within minutes, the authorities were alerted. And the once private sanctuary of wealth became a crime scene, swarming with investigators. Police arrived swiftly, their flashing lights a stark contrast against the manicured lawns and ornate gates of the Sheik's American residence. They found Omar sitting motionless, his hands stained, his eyes distant, as though trapped between denial and despair. He did not resist when they questioned him, but his statements were fragmented, alternating between cold rationalizations and incoherent mutterings about honor and betrayal. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing this was no ordinary domestic dispute. It was the unraveling of a story that would captivate headlines across continents. Forensic teams carefully documented every detail. The room bore the marks of struggle, the evidence speaking louder than any confession. The lavish, once symbols of love and new beginnings, now framed a grim tale of violence. Detectives pieced together the timeline, drawing on staff testimonies and Omar's erratic words. It became clearer that what was meant to be a celebration of union had instead descended into a night of rage and irreversible tragedy. The media frenzy erupted within hours. News channels broadcasted images of the mansion, speculating wildly about what had transpired inside. The shocking detail that Aaliyah had been murdered on her wedding night sent ripples through both Dubai's elite circles and the American public. Commentators debated issues of culture, pride, and obsession, while others focused on the tragic fate of a young bride caught in a clash between tradition and modernity. As the investigation deepened, secrets began to surface that stunned even the police. Documents revealed Omar had been investigating Aaliyah's past long before their wedding, hiring private detectives to confirm his suspicions. It painted a chilling picture of a man obsessed with control, unable to accept anything less than perfection. Yet the true shock came when investigators uncovered a hidden diary of Aaliyah, where she had written of her fears, her desire for a new beginning, and her hope that Omar would see her for who she was, not for the mistakes she had once made. Her words, tender and desperate, stood in stark contrast to the violent end she met. The trial that followed would grip audiences worldwide. Prosecutors portrayed Omar as a man consumed by pride who placed his honor above human life. His defense argued cultural differences and emotional provocation, but the gruesome details of the crime silenced sympathy. To the world, he was not a wronged husband but a murderer who could not control his wrath. In the end, the story of Omar and Aaliyah became more than just a crime. It was a tragedy that raised uncomfortable questions about love, power, and the dangerous consequences of pride unchecked. The Sheikh's name, once synonymous with wealth and influence, was now forever tied to a tale of blood and betrayal. A reminder that no amount of money or status could shield a man from the weight of his own actions.